Illinois, an American Frontier to an American State, Part 3. A key person who helped Illinois become a state was Daniel Pope Cook. Cook arrived in Illinois in 1815 looking for a job. He married well when he married Governor Edwards' daughter. Edwards appointed him auditor of public accounts for the territorial government. Cook was also smart to invest in the territory's first newspaper, the Illinois Herald. Cook began to publish articles that pointed out the undemocratic aspects of territorial government. The governor's absolute veto, the General Assembly could not appoint public officials. Territorial representatives elected to Congress could voice their opinions but could not vote. Cook acknowledged that statehood would be expensive. The federal government would no longer pay the salaries of public officials, so citizens of the state were going to have to tax themselves. However, he argued that statehood would attract new settlers and increase the value of land in Illinois. Cook was elected clerk of the House of Representatives of the Illinois Territory, which was a good position for him to campaign. It was at his urging that a committee draw up a petition requesting statehood. An important part of this process was to have a population census, so Edwards began the process. Cook was too impatient, though. Instead, he and his supporters estimated the population of Illinois to be 40,000, 40,000, and named that figure in their petition for statehood. On December 10th, 1817, the Illinois General Assembly approved the petition and sent it to Washington. Congress appointed Nathaniel Pope, the territorial representative from Illinois, and Cook's uncle, as chairman of the committee to consider the petition of statehood. And I'll put up that outline for a second here. So now then Pope, who's related to Cook, and I have an image of that as well. So the committee discussed the petition and then drafted an act to present to Congress. At the same time, Pope proposed several amendments. The most important was the northern border of Illinois. Given that the existing northern border, based on the Northwest Ordinance, the northern border of the new state needed to be south of Lake Michigan. Chicago and miles of shoreline would not be part of Illinois if that line was not changed. Pope argued that if Illinois had an adequate shoreline, it would be more securely linked to the East Coast via the Great Lakes. He requested that the boundary be set 40 miles to the north, and Congress approved this amendment. Congress approved, and the president signed the act in April 1818. The people of Illinois then turned to the task of developing a state constitution. Illinois voters chose 33 delegates in July 1818 to attend Illinois' first constitutional convention. The men chosen were people that they knew: doctors, sheriffs, lawyers, ministers, shopkeepers, riverboat operators, gentlemen of that stature. The delegates gathered at Kaskaskia in early August and chose Judge Jesse B. Thomas as their chairman. Their first problem occurred when delegates could not officially come up with the required population of 40,000 people. Therefore, they basically cooked the books, they faked it. Later, the federal government placed the actual population in 1818 at 34,620. The delegates, though, counted, in quotes, 40,258, though by 1820 the U.S. Census counted over 55,000 people in the state. A committee of 15, including one person from each county, was chosen to work up a draft of the Constitution. On August 15th, a draft was finally ready. The delegates went through the document article by article and voted on the proposed changes. A short and simple constitution consisting of a preamble and 8 articles was then ready to be sent to Congress. And before 1820, citizens of a state were not required to vote on a constitution. Illinois voters chose Cedric Bond, who was the delegate to Congress from Illinois Territory, as their first governor. The General Assembly met in October to celebrate Bond's inauguration, but not convene a regular session because it could not pass any laws until Congress had approved the Illinois Constitution, which it did in December. So on December 3rd, 1818, President James Monroe signed the act that made Illinois the 21st state of the Union. And for context, you can see this is this is the Missouri Compromise map, which you have in your textbook, something similar to this, but this is 1820, 1821, so this time period. So Illinois is now a state, and so you can see which states are, in quotation marks, free states, and then slave states. Under the first state constitution, the legislature dominated the government. The frontier character of the state and the unhappy memory of the absolute veto power of the governor motivated Illinois voters to place public power in the hands of the legislature. This was actually a rather common 19th century phenomenon in which to have a strong legislature and a weak executive. So keep in mind that the revolution itself, uh, uh, decades earlier, involved rebelling against the crown in England, and so there was always this notion that you did not want to have too strong of an executive branch of government. So it's not going to be later until we get to Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and then into the 20th century where we start to see the continual power of the federal executive become more extreme as the 20th century wears on. But in the 19th century, the legislature, except with a few exceptions, in both state and federal level, tended to be the center of power in American government. The lawmakers were in session just a few months in alternative winters. They selected U.S. senators and also states' Supreme Court justices. Bond, the governor, was paid $1,000 an annual salary, had no direct veto power. He could only veto through committee. So a council of revision consisting of judges of the Supreme Court, or at least a majority of them with the governor, could revise bills and return them with objections to the assembly. The council veto could be overridden with a simple majority vote. Unfortunately, the Illinois judiciary became directly involved in the legislative process, so it could be in direct conflict of interest with justices that had to review laws based on appeal. Another effort to keep the governor weak was to limit him to a single 4-year term that he could not seek re-election until 4 more years had elapsed. So the governor was also limited in what he could actually do officially when it came to positions within his government, because those were positions that were appointed by the legislature. Taxes were also an issue early on. The basis for state taxation was on non-resident owners of land, so those who are absentee owners out of the state. Counties could tax locally owned land and personal property. By an oversight of Congress, though, they had neglected to grant land for a capital for Illinois. It was understood at the time that at the Constitutional Convention that Kaskaskia was way too far south. So Congress eventually granted land to the state, and in 1820 the capital was moved to the small town of Vandalia that was still in frontier conditions. One of the most important issues of early statehood was the issue of slavery. The only article of the new Constitution over which there had been any heated debate was the article that prohibited slavery. In spite of the fact that the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery, slavery did exist in Illinois only under the name of indenture. Indentured servitude in Illinois was different from the colonial form that you've read about in your textbook. A white man could bring blacks under the age of 15 to Illinois and register them to serve until they were 35 if they were male and 32 if they were female. Children born to indentured servants became the property of their mother's master, and the contracts of indentured servants could be bought and sold. Although indentured contracts were said to be voluntary, many blacks signed them only because they had no alternative. If they refused, there was no way for them to obtain employment in the state of Illinois. The indentured laws of the territorial government were still in effect when the constitutional delegates had met. Some delegates did not want slavery outlawed because they thought slaves would relieve a labor shortage on the frontier and make it possible for Western states to compete with older states. Also, many Americans thought of slaves as personal property, with which the government had no right to interfere. Those who opposed slavery thought that the Western lands were not well suited to slave labor, and that in the long run, slaves would basically become an economic burden. Poor white farmers could not compete with slave labor, thereby preventing their settlement in the West. And so that was one of the fears of having slavery in Illinois. Others simply did not want blacks in the state. So there was also just hostility to black people in general, keeping them out of the state. There was a small number of people who believed that slavery was morally wrong. And so that is a core constituency, but it's never a majority, but it is a core constituency, a minority that will eventually become abolitionists. And we'll get with that into that later in the semester. Illinois was ostensibly a free state, so I should put free in quotation marks. However, the General Assembly also passed black laws to deal with slaves and African Americans in the state. These laws would be on the books until the end of the Civil War. These laws stated that slaves could not be brought into Illinois for the purpose of freeing them. Blacks had to prove that they were free by presenting a court certificate whenever asked to. Indentured servants could not bring suit or testify in court. When their master or mistress died, they could be disposed of as property by the executor of a dead person's estate. Pro-slavery members of the General Assembly tried to legalize slavery in the state in 1823. They framed a constitutional amendment that would legalize slavery. But due to the Constitution, it would require a constitutional convention. They eventually got the necessary votes to put the convention to the people of Illinois. However, by now, Edward Coles was governor. Coles was a Southerner who had inherited slaves and brought them to Illinois. He freed them. This was before the Black Laws went into effect. He was an anti-slavery advocate during the Constitutional Convention and one during the present debate. He and other anti-slavery advocates campaigned for a year to convince voters not to call a constitutional convention. Voters eventually rejected the convention, so at least in name, Illinois was a free state. And I should also mention that all of these indentured servants were either African American and a small number were Native American Indians, but the vast majority of these people were African Americans. None of these indentured servants were white Americans or even white immigrants. Now, in terms of the settlement of Illinois, this is something that we need to really keep in mind. Illinois really is settled from the bottom up. So backwoods farmers from Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas made up the first wave of settlers into Illinois, and they chose to settle in the southern part of the state. They were mostly English, Scots-Irish, or Scottish in descent, and there was a smattering of German descent as well. But Germans really don't come in large waves in the United States until we get to the 1840s and 50s. Now, these folks tended to be driven west as plantation owners wanted to bring more land under cultivation. I'll put this map up here. So as settlement moves west, it usually moves horizontally. So people from slave states move west, people from free states move west as well. So these folks wanted to be free of plantation owners who were putting more land under cultivation, so that many of these settlers were being pushed west by plantation owners in the South. And many of these backwoods families just retreated deeper into the wilderness areas. And many of these people were squatters, and the land was purchased out from underneath them. There was also a lifestyle that many of these Southerners brought to Southern Illinois. And that was something that was a combination of hunting, fishing, and farming rather than exclusively farming. This was something that they could not compete with the slave owning plantation owners in the settled areas of the Southeast, but they could have this lifestyle as they moved farther west. So as Indians were suppressed militarily and died of disease, land opened up for these settlers as they headed into Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and Illinois. Southern Illinois appealed to them because these early settlers wanted to settle in wooded areas. This is where they were from, in the mountain regions of the South, and they wanted to find mountainous regions in the West that they were more comfortable with. They were not used to exposed environments such as the prairie, so they didn't want to move into those areas. And while I'm talking about this, let me put up this other map of some of these early Illinois counties. And so you can see as these counties are being formed in Illinois, they're being formed in the South and working their way north. So in the southern area of Illinois, there's plenty of woodlands and the natural environment teemed with game. This was also a period in which people thought that the best farmland was land that had trees on it. To them, the prairie seemed desolate. It was only as land in southern Illinois filled up that settlers were forced to move north along the river valleys into the prairies. And some enterprising farmers began to plant on the prairie and discovered the great fertility of the soil and the great corn crops that they could grow. Now, the Fox and Sac Indians lived near each other and fought side by side in battles with other tribes for decades. They were also united in opposition to white settlers. However, after getting a lot of pressure from the federal government to move west of the Mississippi River, one of their chiefs, Keokuk, agreed to give up tribal land in Illinois and move his people to Iowa, or what would become Iowa. Now, Black Hawk was leader of one band and he refused. I'll put up a picture of Black Hawk here. His village was in the Rock River Valley and stood in the midst of these rich cornfields that had taken years for them to cultivate. In the early 1800s, a treaty had been signed ceding the land on which the village stood to the U.S. government, but allowing the Indians to live there until white settlers arrived. When the white settlers began coming, Black Hawk refused to acknowledge the treaty. Eventually, Black Hawk agreed to move west. However, when he finally led his people into Iowa, hostile Sioux Indians attacked them. Facing starvation, Black Hawk and about 1,500 Sac and Fox Indians came back into Illinois in April of 1832, hoping to find land on which they could plant their corn. Governor John Reynolds and other state officials believed that Black Hawk and his band were out to raid white villages. Reynolds called up the militia, hoping to avoid an armed conflict. Black Hawk sent a flag of truce to the commander of the troops that gathered near his encampment. Unfortunately, the envoys were killed by the militiamen. Black Hawk retaliated and routed the military force. It was a brief victory, though. He led some minor raids, hoping to gain some support from other Indians, but none arrived. Facing starvation of his people and certain defeat fighting a larger militia force, he resolved again to lead his people west of the Mississippi River. And this is a map that gives you an indication of where his his trail was in terms of fighting with the militia units and then trying to evade being defeated by them. So they headed north into present-day Wisconsin and tried to cross the river at a point on the Wisconsin River. They were pursuing soldiers that attacked them and proceeded basically to slaughter men, women, and children. Just it was a total war against this band of Indians. This was the so-called Battle of Bad Axe, which was more of a massacre. Black Hawk was captured and later released to live out his days with Keokuk's band in Iowa. When the Black Hawk War ended, all Native American tribes were ordered out of Illinois, whether they participated in the conflict or not. Even the Kaskaskia Indians, who had fought on the side of the Americans against the Fox and Sac Indians, had to leave, and therefore there really are no Indian reservations in Illinois.